Let's dive right into this explainer, the vase and the vision, overcoming small thinking. We're going to unpack an absolutely incredible story today about pushing past our self-imposed limits and really confronting that deep-seated fear of failure. We hear a ton about strategies for success, but we rarely talk about the invisible ceilings we build for ourselves, right? So today, we're looking at a real-world example of how dramatically your life can change when you simply decide to change the size of your thinking. Have you ever stopped yourself from doing something great because a little voice in your head said, "That is too much for someone like me"? Be honest. Have you ever had a brilliant business idea, but then immediately told yourself to start smaller? Have you ever shrunk your dreams down just so they could fit comfortably inside your doubts? If you've ever made yourself smaller just to fit into what you think is possible, well, this explainer is exactly for you. Part 1, the trap of thinking small. To really understand how we trap ourselves, let me introduce you to a guy named David. Now, David was a 32-year-old man who was perfectly content running his tiny, comfortable convenience store. Be realistic. Do not reach too high or you will fall too hard. A small, steady business is better than a big, risky dream. That was a quote from David's father. And because of this inherited philosophy, David actively ignored his wife Sarah's suggestions to expand into the large, empty lot sitting right next door. He internalized this deeply. Whenever people suggested he grow, he'd just say he was happy with what he had. This mindset became a massive mental barrier. It kept David completely trapped in his comfort zone, convinced that playing it small was the only way to play it safe. But as we're about to see, safety is often just an illusion. Section 2, the supermarket threat. That illusion of safety David had, it was violently shattered when a massive, modern, and very cheap supermarket chain announced it was opening just 2 blocks away. And this perfectly illustrates how quickly a so-called safe business can just collapse. On day 1, the supermarket announces they're opening 2 blocks away. Fast forward just 3 months later, and David's customer traffic drops by half. People he knew for years were just walking right past his store because the giant competitor was, well, more convenient. And then comes the breaking point. After 15 years in business, David experienced his absolute worst sales day ever. His savings were dwindling, the bills were piling up, and the small, steady business his father built was actively dying. Thinking small had not protected him. It had left him defenseless. That evening, David locked his doors early, sat on the floor behind his counter, and just put his head in his hands. He realized a really harsh, brutal truth. Playing it safe was actually the biggest risk of all. By refusing to grow when he had the chance, he hadn't avoided risk at all. He was totally exposed. The cup versus the vase. Desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So, David's wife Sarah finally convinces a terrified David to visit Mr. Chun. Now, Mr. Chun was a highly successful businessman up in his 20th floor office who started out in their exact same town with absolutely nothing. Standing in that beautiful 20th floor office, David confesses to Mr. Chun that he just isn't the kind of person who builds big things. But Mr. Chun counters with this brilliant observation about the reality of failure. He points out that most people fail in life not because they aim too high and miss. No, they fail because they aim too low and hit. They spend their entire lives successfully building small, safe things, completely blind to the fact that they always had the capacity for greatness. Crazy to think about, right? The water expands to fill the container, but only if you choose the bigger container. To really drive this home, Mr. Chun uses a powerful visual analogy. He takes a small cup and a large vase. He fills the small cup with water, noting how it feels safe and contained, but, it can never become more than what it is. Then, he pours that exact same water into the large vase, where it barely covers the bottom. He fills the rest of the vase up, showing David that the exact same water, the exact same effort, has the room to expand and become magnificent. He tells David point blank, "The store isn't your limit. Your thinking is your limit." Shifting the paradigm. David feels something inside him finally crack open, but obviously the fear is still there. David's big fear is, what if I try and fail? But Mr. Chung completely dismantles that internal monologue with a hard-hitting truth. Failure teaches you, regret just haunts you. He explains that the pain of regret for never trying is infinitely heavier than the pain of trying and failing. He totally reframed David's fear of failure into the much more terrifying fear of lifelong regret. Let's move to the next chapter, building a community. We're going to see how all of this builds into massive action. David leaves that 20th floor office with his mind absolutely spinning. That very night, he and Sarah stay up until 3 in the morning, not worrying, but actually planning a massive transformation. Let's look at this leap of faith. These are the bold, literally terrifying steps David took to execute his big vision. The very next morning, he called the owner of the empty lot next door. He made an incredibly ambitious offer using every cent of their savings. He signed a loan that made his hands physically shake. Construction began, and he expanded his store to 3 times its original size. And yeah, people in town called him crazy. They told him competing with a giant supermarket would never work. But David wasn't just expanding. He was shifting his entire focus from competing on cheap prices to providing genuine community. He built a completely new kind of store. He didn't just make it bigger, he made it different. Groceries and fresh local produce made up about 40% of the space. But look at the rest of this breakdown. 35% was dedicated to a community cafe, where neighbors could actually sit and talk. Another 25% was set aside for local art displays and a community connection board. David created a space where people came not just to buy a bar of soap, but to actually belong. 3 months. That's the crucial point here. Just 3 months after opening, the store was busier than it had been in 30 years. The cafe became the morning gathering spot. The local produce drew in crowds looking for personal service. It wasn't bigger than the supermarket, but it was beating the corporate giant, because big thinking and a personal touch will always beat cold efficiency. 6 months later, Mr. Chun visited the new store, looked around at the buzzing cafe and chatting customers, and told David with tears in his eyes, "You didn't just save a store, you built a community." Blueprint for big thinking. Now that we've seen David and Mr. Chun celebrate this absolutely incredible success, let's distill this narrative down into the core rules that you can immediately apply to your own life and ambitions. Here are your 3 rules of big thinking. Rule number 1, your thinking size determines your results. Small thinking creates small results, even if you're putting in huge effort. Rule number 2, you don't need to know the how today, just think it's possible. Seriously, the how always reveals itself to those who dare to ask, what if? And rule number 3, which is probably the most important, regret for not trying will haunt you way longer than failure. At least failure teaches you something, right? Regret just whispers what if for the rest of your life. So I want to directly challenge you right now. If I knew I could not fail, what would I attempt? Look at your career trajectory, look at your relationships, or your creative work. I want you to actually write down the big, audacious version of your goals, and whatever you do not shrink them down. Because the reality is, you aren't limited by your circumstances. You are only limited by your willingness to think beyond them. David lived in a small cup for years before he realized he could have had the whole vase. So as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this powerful question. What if the vase is waiting? Stop asking yourself, can I, and finally pick up the bigger container today. Thanks for joining me, and keep thinking big.